The history of the United States is often framed as a sequence of defining moments. Declarations signed, wars fought, elections decided, crises announced to the world. These events dominate textbooks and public memory because they are visible, dramatic, and easily dated. Yet, from a scientific and historical perspective, this is only one layer of how societies actually change. Beneath the surface of landmark events, another history unfolds. Slower, quieter, and far less visible. A history shaped by incremental decisions, environmental pressures, institutional routines, and cultural adaptations that rarely announce themselves as turning points. By the time their consequences become obvious, the process that caused them is usually long past. In the United States, this pattern is not an exception. It is a defining characteristic. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe if you're enjoying Primal Roots.
From the earliest phases of European colonization, the North American continent functioned as a complex ecological and social system. Diverse climates, vast river networks, fertile plains, fragile soils, and unpredictable weather patterns imposed constraints that no political ideology could override. Human societies adapted to these constraints gradually, often without recognizing the long-term implications of those adaptations.
Historical ecology and environmental anthropology demonstrate that settlement patterns across North America were not determined solely by ambition or policy, but by subtle interactions between landscape, technology, and institutional choices. Where crops could reliably grow, where water could be controlled, where transport routes slowly shifted from rivers to rail and later to highways. Each transition appeared rational within its own moment. Together, they redirected the trajectory of entire regions. What makes these moments hidden is not secrecy, but scale. They unfold at a pace that resists human perception. Scientific studies of complex societies show that gradual processes are often more transformative than sudden shocks. This principle appears repeatedly in archaeological records, evolutionary biology, and systems theory. Change accumulates. Feedback loops reinforce earlier decisions. Adaptations that solve short-term problems introduce long-term vulnerabilities. In the American context, this dynamic became especially pronounced during periods of expansion. Land policies, administrative boundaries, and economic incentives were frequently designed using abstract models, disconnected from local ecological realities. On paper, these systems appeared efficient. On the ground, they interacted with soils, climates, and human communities in unpredictable ways. Over time, these interactions reshaped migration flows, labor systems, and regional identities. Anthropological research highlights that societies rarely perceive these shifts as historical while living through them. They are experienced as normal adjustments. A new regulation, a change in land use, a different crop, a relocated trade route. Each seems minor, none feel revolutionary, yet together they reorganize social life. The United States offers a clear example of this process because of its scale and diversity. The same federal decisions produced radically different outcomes across deserts, forests, river valleys, and industrial corridors. What strengthened one region quietly weakened another. This asymmetry is crucial. Economic historians have documented how regional transformations often occurred without national awareness. Local declines in agricultural productivity, subtle increases in disease linked to environmental modification, gradual depopulation of rural areas as economic networks reoriented elsewhere. None of these changes triggered immediate alarm. They unfolded beneath the threshold of political urgency. From a biological perspective, human populations respond to environmental stress through migration, behavioral change, and social restructuring. These responses are adaptive in the short term. Over generations, however, they alter demographic patterns, health outcomes, and cultural continuity. In the United States, these biological and cultural responses intertwined with policy decisions in ways that were rarely anticipated. Infrastructure development favored certain corridors. Resource extraction altered ecosystems faster than they could regenerate. Administrative decisions froze these changes into law. The result was not collapse, but transformation. This distinction matters. Collapse implies failure. What occurred instead was reconfiguration. Communities lost relevance. Cities declined without disaster. Entire ways of life faded without a single decisive moment. The nation moved forward, but not evenly. Scientific history emphasizes that such transformations are easiest to understand only in hindsight. When data accumulates, when demographic records reveal long-term trends, when environmental consequences become measurable. At the time, these moments were nearly invisible. They were not dramatic enough to resist, not obvious enough to debate, not urgent enough to reverse, and yet they changed everything. By examining these hidden processes, the narrative of American history expands beyond heroes and crises. It becomes a story of adaptation, constraint, and cumulative consequence. A story shaped as much by silence as by speech, by what went unnoticed as by what was celebrated. This is where the true turning points often reside, not in moments of noise, but in stretches of time when change felt ordinary, inevitable, and unremarkable. Understanding this quieter history is essential, because the forces that shaped the past did not disappear. They continue to operate slowly, persistently, and largely unseen. And only by recognizing them can the present be fully understood. As the United States expanded across the continent, environmental conditions did not merely form the backdrop of history. They actively shaped economic behavior, institutional responses, and patterns of human adaptation. The interaction between landscape and society operated continuously, often unnoticed, gradually redefining what regions could sustain and what communities could endure. Environmental historians emphasize that stress rarely announces itself as crisis. Instead, it accumulates. Soil fertility declines incrementally. Water tables shift slowly. Forests thin out before they disappear. These changes unfold over decades, sometimes generations, creating a false sense of stability even as underlying systems weaken. In North America, this pattern became especially visible during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Agricultural expansion moved rapidly into environments that were only marginally suited for intensive farming. Short-term productivity masked long-term vulnerability. Favorable climate cycles reinforced confidence. Economic incentives encouraged further settlement. From the perspective of historical ecology, these were adaptive responses within limited knowledge systems. Research by environmental historian William Cronon has demonstrated how American economic development repeatedly transformed ecosystems in ways that were initially profitable, but structurally unsustainable. Landscapes were simplified. Biodiversity declined. Natural buffers against drought and erosion were removed. These processes were not driven by ignorance alone, but by institutional momentum and market logic. Over time, the consequences became unavoidable. Anthropological data shows that communities experiencing gradual environmental degradation respond in predictable ways. They diversify livelihoods. They rely more heavily on external markets. They increase mobility. When these strategies fail, migration accelerates. What appears in hindsight as abandonment or decline is often the final stage of a long adaptive process. In the United States, these patterns played out unevenly across regions. River systems that once supported dense populations lost reliability as upstream modifications altered flow regimes. Farming communities faced declining yields without clear explanations. Urban centers grew rapidly, drawing resources and labor from rural hinterlands that quietly weakened as a result. Economic historians analyzing census data and regional production records have shown that many local downturns never registered as national events. They did not align with stock market crashes or political upheavals. Instead, they appeared as subtle demographic shifts: fewer births, more outmigration, aging populations, declining infrastructure investment. From a systems perspective, these were early warning signals. The biological dimension of this transformation is often overlooked. Human health, nutrition, and resilience are directly linked to environmental conditions. Studies in bioarchaeology and historical demography reveal correlations between land degradation, food insecurity, and increased disease burden. These effects rarely trigger immediate collapse. They reduce margins of safety. In ecological terms, resilience erodes before failure occurs. As industrialization accelerated, the relationship between environment and economy became more complex, not less. Industrial centers depended on distant resources. Energy extraction reshaped entire regions. Pollution accumulated slowly, often without regulation or public awareness. Communities adapted to declining environmental quality as a new normal. Anthropologists describe this phenomenon as baseline shift. Each generation perceives the conditions of its youth as standard. Degradation becomes invisible because memory does not extend far enough back to recognize loss. This concept, widely discussed in environmental science literature, helps explain why many transformative moments in American history were not recognized when they occurred. The system changed, but perception lagged behind reality. Administrative decisions reinforced these dynamics. Infrastructure investments prioritized efficiency over resilience. Economic models favored growth indicators without accounting for ecological cost. Policies assumed environmental stability that did not exist. The cumulative effect was structural. By the mid-20th century, many regions had crossed thresholds that could not be easily reversed. Aquifers were depleted. Soils lost productive capacity. Local economies became dependent on external inputs. When shocks finally arrived, they exposed vulnerabilities that had been developing for decades. Importantly, scientific consensus does not frame these outcomes as failures of intention. Rather, they reflect the limitations of decision-making in complex systems. As historian and geographer Donald Worster has argued, societies often act rationally within short-term horizons while unknowingly undermining long-term stability. The United States followed this pattern repeatedly. What makes these turning points invisible is not the absence of evidence, but the fragmentation of impact. No single moment defines the change. No single actor controls the outcome. Responsibility disperses across time, institutions, and landscapes. From an evolutionary perspective, this is consistent with how human societies adapt. Cultural systems evolve faster than biological ones. Technology extends capacity temporarily. When limits are reached, adjustment becomes unavoidable. In American history, adjustment often took the form of relocation, economic restructuring, or social reorganization. Communities dissolved without conflict. Regions lost relevance without war. These transitions rarely entered national narratives because they lacked drama. Yet their cumulative effect reshaped the nation. By integrating environmental data, economic records, and anthropological theory, a clearer picture emerges. The United States was not transformed only by decisive events, but by prolonged exposure to environmental stress, filtered through economic systems and institutional choices. This understanding challenges traditional historical framing. It replaces linear progress with adaptive cycles. It emphasizes constraint over intention. It reveals how power operates quietly through infrastructure, policy, and ecological modification. Most importantly, it demonstrates that history is not only made by those who act, but by the systems within which action occurs. These invisible turning points did not end. They stabilized into structures that continue to influence regional inequality, environmental vulnerability, and social resilience today. Recognizing them requires a shift in perspective, away from moments, toward processes. And that shift changes how the past and the present are understood. As environmental pressures and economic transformations accumulated across the United States, their effects did not remain confined to landscapes or local communities. Over time, they became embedded within institutions. Laws, administrative systems, infrastructure networks, and cultural norms absorbed the consequences of earlier adaptations, translating gradual change into long-lasting structural realities. Institutions, from a scientific perspective, function as memory systems. They preserve decisions long after the original context has disappeared. Once established, they tend to persist, even when the conditions that justified them no longer exist. This phenomenon is well documented in historical sociology and political anthropology, where it is described as path dependence. In the United States, path dependence played a decisive role in transforming hidden processes into permanent features of national life. Policies designed to manage land, water, labor, and resources were often reactive rather than anticipatory. They addressed immediate pressures while implicitly locking future generations into specific trajectories. Infrastructure followed existing economic flows. Legal frameworks reinforced prevailing power structures. Environmental costs were externalized, normalized, and eventually forgotten. From the outside, these developments appeared orderly. From within, they were rarely questioned. Anthropological research shows that societies adapt not only to environments, but to their own institutions. Once a system becomes familiar, it is perceived as natural. Alternatives become difficult to imagine. This cognitive narrowing explains why many long-term consequences of historical decisions remained unchallenged, even as evidence of imbalance accumulated. In the American case, this process shaped regional inequality, demographic distribution, and environmental vulnerability. Areas that benefited early from infrastructure investment and ecological compatibility gained momentum. Others entered cycles of decline that were gradual, persistent, and politically invisible. Importantly, this was not the result of coordinated intent. It emerged from the interaction between economic incentives, institutional inertia, and environmental constraint. Historical demography illustrates how population movements responded to these forces. Migration patterns shifted quietly. Young adults left regions with declining opportunity. Older populations remained behind. Over decades, these changes altered voting behavior, public investment, and cultural identity. None of this occurred suddenly. It unfolded as a slow redistribution of human potential. Biologically, such shifts affect community resilience. Aging populations face increased health burdens. Reduced economic diversity limits adaptive capacity. Social networks thin out. These factors interact, reinforcing vulnerability without producing a single identifiable breaking point. This is why many transformative moments in American history lack clear dates. Cultural memory tends to preserve moments of rupture, wars, crashes, disasters. Yet science shows that systemic change more often resembles erosion than explosion. What disappears does so incrementally. What emerges feels inevitable only in retrospect. Environmental scientists refer to this dynamic as threshold behavior. Systems absorb stress until a limit is crossed, after which recovery becomes difficult or impossible. Crucially, thresholds are rarely visible until they are exceeded. By the time outcomes become undeniable, options have narrowed. In the United States, many thresholds were crossed quietly. Ecosystems lost regenerative capacity. Local economies became structurally dependent. Social inequalities hardened into patterns. These developments did not announce themselves as historical turning points. They stabilized into the background conditions of everyday life. This stabilization is where power becomes most effective. When outcomes are perceived as natural, they are less likely to be contested. Institutional arrangements appear neutral. Environmental degradation is reframed as economic necessity. Social disparities are explained through individual behavior rather than structural history. Scientific analysis challenges this framing. By reconstructing long-term processes, it reveals how present conditions are the cumulative result of earlier adaptations. It shows that what appears inevitable was once contingent. This perspective reshapes the narrative of American history. It shifts attention away from singular actors and toward interacting systems. It emphasizes constraint alongside choice. It recognizes that agency operates within ecological and institutional boundaries. The final implication is forward-looking. The processes examined here did not end in the past. They continue, operating at similar temporal scales. Environmental stress accumulates. Institutional decisions compound. Social adaptation responds incrementally. The same mechanisms that shaped earlier transformations remain active. Science does not offer simple predictions. It does, however, provide pattern recognition. Societies that fail to detect slow change tend to overestimate stability. They respond late when adjustment is costly. Those that recognize gradual signals early retain flexibility. Understanding the hidden moments that shaped the United States is therefore not an exercise in revisionism. It is an application of scientific insight to historical experience. The lesson is not that history is predetermined. It is that history is often decided long before it is noticed. What ultimately changed the United States was not only what people fought over, celebrated, or declared. It was also what they adapted to without protest, what they normalized, what they allowed to accumulate. These are the moments that rarely receive names, yet they define the contours of the present. To see them clearly is to understand that the most powerful forces in human history are often the quietest ones. And that recognition, more than any dramatic event, is what allows societies to imagine different futures. If this perspective changed how you see American history, keep exploring the forces that operate beneath the surface. Question simple narratives, follow the evidence, and observe the slow processes shaping the present before they become history.